In a quiet corner of Glenwood Springs, Colorado, where the mountains cast long shadows over snow-covered streets, an unlikely battle is about to unfold. At the aging Pine Ridge Apartments, where families have lived peacefully for decades, a ruthless Venezuelan gang is about to learn that appearances can be fatally deceiving. They think they're dealing with just another elderly resident, a Hollywood legend well past his prime. They couldn't be more wrong. Clint Eastwood isn't just the iconic actor who brought legendary tough guys to life on the silver screen. He carries something far more dangerous than his famous screen presence: decades of real-world experience, tactical knowledge from his military service, and the same unwavering determination that made him a symbol of American grit. With his loyal bull terrier, Tino, by his side, he's about to prove that some old soldiers never lose their edge. This is not just another tale of good versus evil. This is the story of how the notorious Tren de Aragua, a gang that terrorized South America before setting its sights on American soil, learned the hard way that they chose the wrong building, the wrong community, and the wrong man to underestimate. What follows is a masterclass in psychological warfare. How one man, armed with nothing but his wits, a loyal dog, and a handful of determined allies, will dismantle an entire criminal empire in just 3 days, using nothing but experience, intelligence, and the same commanding presence that captivated audiences for over half a century. When they came to take over Pine Ridge Apartments, they thought they were simply adding another piece to their criminal empire. Instead, they walked into a carefully orchestrated performance, directed by a master storyteller who knows that the most powerful weapons aren't always guns. Sometimes they're the shadows that haunt men's minds, the fear that follows silence, and the unstoppable force of a legend who refuses to fade away. Before we dive into this incredible story of courage, strategy, and the power of unbreakable will, ask yourself, what would you do if evil showed up at your doorstep? For Clint Eastwood, the answer was simple: you give them a show they'll never forget, and a lesson they'll never survive. Welcome to the last stand at Pine Ridge, where an American icon proves that some roles aren't just played, they're lived. Let me know where you're watching from, and if you're ready for a high-stakes showdown, make sure you're subscribed. Let's grow together in 2025. The snow fell silently over Pine Ridge Apartments in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, coating the aging 3-story complex in a deceptive blanket of serenity. Clint Eastwood stood at his 3rd-floor window, his weathered face reflected in the glass as he watched a group of unfamiliar men lingering near the building's entrance. At this age, he'd seen enough trouble in his lifetime, both in movies and real life, to recognize its approach. Tino, his white bull terrier, growled softly beside him, the dog's muscular frame tensed, nose twitching at the strange scents wafting up from below. "Easy, boy," Clint murmured, his voice carrying that same gravelly authority that had commanded Hollywood sets for decades. "We're just watching for now." The past week had brought changes to Pine Ridge, subtle at first, then increasingly obvious. New tenants had moved in suddenly, taking over vacant units without any apparent paperwork. The building's longtime manager, Mrs. Chun, had gone on vacation according to a hastily posted notice. Clint had noticed the security cameras being disabled one by one, replaced with new ones that reported to unknown observers. His phone buzzed a text from Marcus Reynolds, the retired Navy SEAL who lived 2 floors below. "Meeting. Your place. 30 minutes. Bringing intel." Clint moved away from the window, his joints protesting as he settled into his favorite armchair. The apartment wasn't much a modest 2-bedroom unit filled with memories from his career and photos of old friends, most now gone. But it was home, and he'd be damned if he'd let anyone threaten that. A soft knock came exactly 30 minutes later. Tino's ears perked up, but he remained calm. He knew Marcus's scent. The former SEAL entered, followed by Sarah Chun, Mrs. Chun's daughter, and an FBI cybercrimes analyst who'd been visiting. When everything started changing, "It's worse than we thought," Marcus said without preamble, spreading photos across Clint's coffee table. Their Tren de Aragua, Venezuelan prison gang, turned international criminal organization. They've been expanding across South America. Now they're pushing into the US. Sarah pulled up additional information on her laptop. They've taken over apartment complexes like this in 3 other states. They use them as bases for human trafficking, drug distribution, extortion. My mother. Her voice caught. She's alive, but they're holding her somewhere in the building, along with at least 7 other residents. Clint studied the photos, his expression hardening. Why here? Location, Marcus explained. Small town, minimal law enforcement presence. Building's layout makes it defensible. Highway access for their operations, but mainly, he pointed to a map. They're setting up a network, taking over properties along drug trafficking routes. Pine Ridge is a crucial checkpoint for them. The local police? Sarah shook her head. Compromised. 2 officers on their payroll. Anyone we alert could tip them off, and they've got at least 20 armed men in the building now. Clint rose, moving to a locked cabinet in his study. Inside was a reminder of his past, not from Hollywood, but from before, when he'd served in the Army as a swimming instructor at Fort Ord. While not special forces like Marcus, he'd maintained connections and skills over the years, driven by the same preparedness that had shaped his most famous characters. Tell me about their leader, he said, removing a weathered notebook. Alejandro El Profesor Ruiz, Sarah replied. Ex-university teacher turned gang leader. Brilliant, ruthless. He uses a combination of psychological manipulation and brutal violence. He's been here personally overseeing the takeover. Clint's fingers traced the notebook's worn cover. You've got evidence? Enough to bring them down, if we can get it to the right people? Sarah nodded. Everything's documented. But we need to secure the hostages first. If they realize we're moving against them. A commotion erupted in the hallway, shouting. A woman's scream quickly muffled. Tino growled, moving to the door. They're starting their next phase, Marcus said grimly. Going unit by unit, forcing everyone to either pay protection money or leave. Those who resist, he didn't need to finish. Clint walked to his window again, looking out over the snow-covered parking lot. In his mind, he could hear the echoes of lines from countless scripts. A man's got to know his limitations. But he also remembered other words, not from movies, but from life. Sometimes the only choice is to stand. He turned back to his visitors, his face set with the same determination that had made him an icon. Marcus, what resources do you have access to? Some equipment in my apartment. 3 former teammates within 4 hours' drive. They'll come if I call. No questions asked. Sarah? She straightened. Building schematics, security system access, real-time surveillance monitoring, and I can create a digital smokescreen if we need it. Clint looked down at Tino, who stared back with unwavering loyalty. Well, boy, looks like we've got one more fight in us. He turned to the others. We're not just going to stop them. We're going to make sure they never want to try this again. But as they began to plan, Clint felt the weight of what wasn't being said. Age wasn't just a number. His body had limits now that no amount of determination could overcome. Yet somehow, that made the situation clearer. He couldn't outfight them, couldn't outrun them. But after nearly a century of life and over 60 years in movies, he knew something more valuable: how to tell a story. And sometimes, the right story could be more powerful than any weapon. First, he said, we need to understand exactly who we're dealing with. Sarah, show me everything you have on El Profesor. Marcus, map out their patrol patterns. Before we make any move. He paused, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. We need to know our audience. As the others began their tasks, Clint felt Tino lean against his leg, a solid presence grounding him in the moment. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the building, a clock struck midnight. The next 24 hours would determine not just their fate, but the future of an entire community. And for Clint Eastwood, it would be the role of a lifetime, not played for cameras, but for the highest stakes imaginable. Dawn broke over Pine Ridge Apartments, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Clint sat at his kitchen table, cleaning his Colt 1911, a weapon he'd kept meticulously maintained since his army days. Beside him, Marcus studied building blueprints, while Sarah monitored security feeds on her laptop. El Professor's men are getting bolder, Sarah reported, her voice tight with concern. They're going door to door now, demanding rent payments. Mrs. Johnson in 2B tried to refuse. She swallowed hard. They took her grandson, Clint's hands stilled on the weapon. Where are they keeping the hostages? Basement level, storage area C. Marcus replied. Heavy guard presence. They've converted it into a makeshift prison. But that's not our biggest problem. He pointed to several marks on the blueprint. They've rigged explosives at key structural points. Insurance policy. If anything goes wrong, they can bring down half the building. The news settled like ice in Clint's stomach, but his expression remained unchanged. He'd played enough heroes to know that showing fear wasn't an option. Tell me about their routines. Sarah pulled up surveillance footage. Guards rotate every 4 hours. Most are ex-military, Venezuelan army deserters. They're trained, disciplined. El Profesor runs this place like a military operation. No, Clint corrected, studying the footage. He runs it like a theater. At their questioning looks, he continued. Everything's choreographed. The patrols, the intimidation, the way they handle residents, it's all for show. He's not just trying to control the building, he's trying to control the narrative. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Tino's hackles rose, but Clint raised a hand, keeping him quiet. Through the peephole, he saw 2 of El Professor's men, dressed in casual clothes that didn't quite hide their weapons. Mr. Eastwood, one called out. Building inspection. Please open up. Clint looked at Marcus and Sarah, who quickly moved to hidden positions. Then, channeling decades of screen presence, he opened the door with the perfect mix of elderly confusion and irritation. Kind of early for inspections, isn't it? He growled, letting his fatigue show. The men pushed past him, eyes scanning the apartment. New management policy, the first one said. His English was perfect. His smile practiced. We're checking all units for safety compliance. As they moved through his home, Clint played his role perfectly, the grumpy old man, just famous enough to be treated with caution, just difficult enough to be believable. When they reached his study, one guard paused at a framed poster from Unforgiven. You know, the guard said, my father loved your movies. Said you taught him what it meant to be a man. Clint met his eyes in the reflection on the glass. And what did you learn from them? The guard's smile faltered slightly, that the world belongs to those willing to take it. After they left, Sarah emerged from hiding, her face pale. That was too close. They're going to search every unit. Marcus's equipment will be found, Clint finished. Unless we give them something else to find. He turned to Marcus. How long until your team arrives? 6 hours minimum. But if they find my gear before then, Clint walked to his window, Tino at his heel. Below, he could see more of El Professor's men entering the building. Then we changed the script. He turned back to his companions. Sarah, you said you could create a digital smokescreen. What exactly did you mean? As Sarah explained her capabilities, a plan began to form. It wasn't the direct assault Marcus had been preparing for, but something more subtle, a play in multiple acts. That would turn El Professor's theatrical tendencies against him. The first act began an hour later. Sarah's fingers flew over her keyboard, and suddenly, every screen in the building phones, laptops, even the security monitors flickered with images of police cars approaching. The guards reacted instantly, radioing warnings, redirecting patrols, but there were no police. While they were distracted, Marcus slipped out of Clint's apartment, using the confusion to move his equipment. Not to hide it, but to plant it pieces strategically placed to tell a story of their own. By noon, El Profesor himself arrived, drawn by reports of the phantom police presence. Clint watched through his peephole as the man strode past, tall, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone used to commanding rooms full of students. But there was something else in his walk, something Clint recognized from countless on-screen villains, the slight tension of someone who knows they're being watched. Clint murmured to Tino, time to give him something to see. He made his way to the building's common room, timing his arrival perfectly. El Profesor was there, questioning his men about the morning's events. Clint shuffled in, apparently engrossed in a newspaper. Mr. Eastwood, El Professor's voice carried the warmth of a true fan. What an honor. I hope my men haven't disturbed your morning? Clint lowered his paper, fixing El Profesor with the same steely gaze that had defined his career. Funny thing about mornings, he said, his voice pitched to carry. They have a way of showing you what's real and what's just shadows. The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. El Professor's smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened. Indeed, sometimes shadows can be very dangerous things, only if you're afraid of the dark. The exchange lasted less than a minute, but its effect rippled through the building. Residents who witnessed it straightened slightly. Guards exchanged uncertain glances. And El Profesor looked at Clint with new eyes, seeing not just an aging actor, but something more dangerous, a symbol. Back in his apartment, Clint received confirmation from Sarah during the distraction. Marcus had successfully moved the last of his equipment. But more importantly, the seeds of doubt had been planted. They'll search the building top to bottom now, Marcus said, and they'll find exactly what we want them to find. Sarah's laptop showed multiple searches already underway. They're getting sloppy. Missed their last 2 guard rotations. Clint nodded, feeling the pieces falling into place. Fear does that, makes you jump at shadows. He checked his watch. 4 hours until your team arrives, Marcus. Let's give them something real to be afraid of. As if on cue, Tino growled softly. A new sound had joined the building's atmosphere. Somewhere below, raised voices echoed through the halls. The third act was about to begin. The sun was setting over Pine Ridge Apartments, casting long shadows through snow-streaked windows. In Clint's apartment, the atmosphere was tense with anticipation. Marcus's team had arrived 3 hard-faced men who moved like ghosts through the building's blind spots, but they weren't there for a frontal assault. Everything's in position, Sarah reported, her fingers dancing across her laptop. Their communication network is compromised. Each team will receive different orders, all appearing to come from El Profesor. Clint watched the security feeds, Tino alert beside him. The chaos they'd orchestrated throughout the day had done its work. El Profesor's men were exhausted, jumping at shadows, their carefully choreographed routines in shambles. They found the weapons cache we planted in 3C, Marcus said, and the fake intelligence documents in the maintenance room. Right now, El Profesor has 3 different theories about who we are and what we're planning, none of them correct. And the hostages? Clint's voice carried the weight of genuine concern. Guards are down to 2 men. They're nervous, distracted, perfect for what comes next. Clint rose, feeling every one of his ears, but refusing to show it. Then it's time for the final act. He turned to Sarah. Send the signal. What happened next was a masterpiece of coordination and psychological warfare. Sarah's digital assault began with a cascade of false alarm security breaches, police reports, even fake news bulletins about Tren de Aragua operations being busted across the country. Simultaneously, Marcus's team began their work, not with violence, but with carefully orchestrated incidents that seemed to confirm El Profesor's worst fears. A guard would catch a glimpse of movement, pursue it, only to find evidence suggesting federal surveillance. Another would receive orders to relocate hostages, only to encounter conflicting commands. And through it all, Clint waited. When El Profesor finally came to his door, it wasn't with guards or threats. He came alone, his composed facade cracking. Who are you really? He demanded as Clint opened the door. CIA? DEA? Clint stood in his doorway, Tino at his side, the picture of calm authority. Just an old man who's seen enough movies to know how this story ends. You think this is a game? Our professor's voice rose. I have hostages, explosives. One command from me. You have nothing. Clint interrupted, his voice carrying the same power that had commanded screens for generations. Your men are scattered. Your hostages are already being freed. And those explosives? He smiled grimly. Check your phone. Our professor's phone buzzed on cue. Sarah's work surveillance footage, showing Marcus's team quietly disarming each explosive device over the past hour, intercut with images of police units moving into position around the building. You're bluffing, El Profesor whispered, but his face had gone pale. Am I? Clint stepped forward, and despite his age, despite everything, El Profesor stepped back. You wanted to write a story about fear, about power, but you forgot the most important rule of storytelling. He let his voice drop to that familiar growl that had thrilled audiences for decades. The best stories are true. The raid, when it came, was anticlimactic. Most of Al Professor's men surrendered without resistance, their will to fight broken by hours of psychological warfare. Those who tried to resist found themselves already surrounded, their escape routes cut off by Marcus's team. In the end, it wasn't bullets or brute force that won the day. It was a story, a carefully crafted narrative. That turned El Professor's theatrical operation against itself. The hostages were freed. Mrs. Chun reunited with her daughter, and the residents of Pine Ridge began the process of recovery. But something had changed in Pine Ridge, something deeper than just the removal of a criminal threat. In the days that followed, Clint watched from his window as the community transformed. Neighbors who had once barely spoken now gathered in the common room, sharing their experiences, supporting each other. Marcus's team quietly disappeared, but their legacy remained in the form of improved security measures and a new awareness among the residents. Mrs. Johnson's grandson, Tommy, started spending afternoons with Clint, listening to stories about Hollywood and life, though some stories, like the events of that day, would have to wait until he was older. Tino had taken to the boy, their games in the snow bringing new life to the old courtyard. Sarah stayed on, helping her mother resettle into her role as building manager. But now she had a different mission, teaching the residents basic cybersecurity, showing them how to protect themselves in ways that went beyond locks and cameras. One evening, about a week after the raid, Clint found a package outside his door. Inside was a framed poster from Unforgiven, the same one the guard had admired. But this one was different. It bore an inscription from the FBI team that had made the actual arrests to the man who reminded us that the most powerful weapon is the story we choose to tell. El Profesor and his top lieutenants faced federal charges, their network crumbling as other communities, inspired by Pine Ridge, began to push back. The two corrupt police officers were quietly arrested, their involvement exposed through Sarah's carefully preserved evidence. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the residents carried themselves. They walked taller, watched out for each other more carefully. The building's security cameras remained, but now they reported to a community watch system that Sarah had designed. Marcus's military contacts helped establish a legitimate security training program for interested residents. In the end, Pine Ridge hadn't just survived a takeover attempt. It had become something more, a symbol, a beginning. And for Clint Eastwood, it had become his most important role, yet not as a hero who saved the day alone, but as part of a community that learned to save itself. As he began to write, Clint smiled. After all, every great story deserves a sequel. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating content. Until next time, stay curious and stay inspired.